Yes, that's right. Today I'm joined by Lee and Paul from The Sweeper, the podcast that gets to those hard-to-reach spots all over world football. Of course, we'll be staying on a European focus, but hopefully we'll be hitting a few of those spots that maybe we don't always get to on the continent. You're joining us from far and wide in Europe today, fellas.
Yes, I'm based in Vienna, so a close eye on the Austrian Bundesliga always.
Yeah, I'm in Stroud, so I'm in Forest Green Rovers heartland. I'm not sure if that counts. Does that count as exotic? Is that far and wide? I don't know. I think I'll let the side down.
I certainly think it's the first time that Forest Green Rovers and Heartland have ever been put in the same sentence. So, well done on that. While we're talking about atmosphere, our part one is about a real shock in the other Bundesliga, because finally a decade of Red Bull Salzburg dominating the Austrian Bundesliga came to its end. I'm going to start with you on this one, Lee, because you're right at the heart of the action. Sturm Graz won the league, won the double, ending that 10-year run. How did they manage it?
Well, I think a combination of factors. The sporting leadership is the big factor, really. They had an amazing head coach, Christian Ilzer, and a really good sporting director as well, Andreas Schicker. They've both since departed to Hoffenheim in the German Bundesliga in the last few months, but they were a formidable duo together. And between them, they put together an amazing team. Some of the recruitment at Sturm Graz has been absolutely outstanding. I think most of the listeners will be familiar with Rasmus Højlund, who they signed for 1.6 million from FC Copenhagen and then sold him on to Manchester. Well, he went via Atalanta to Manchester United for 72 million 1.5 years later. But other players from the Premier League as well. Mika Biereth from Arsenal, the Liverpool goalkeeper Vyacheslav Jarosz came on loan. And also the Georgia midfielder Otar Kitaishvili, who was the Bundesliga player of the season. So there was some really shrewd recruitment in there. And I think on the pitch, things just came together. After a period of 4 years of working together, they started to look like a really well-oiled machine. They were starting to match Salzburg for physicality, running performance. And this was all happening at a time where Salzburg were having one of their worst seasons in years. So it all just kind of came together as a perfect storm.
Before we come on to more elements of that perfect storm, Paul, let's keep with Sturm Graz at the moment, because it's fascinating to me. As Lee was saying, Ilzer has just come over to the Bundesliga, joined Hoffenheim in November following his sporting director. And he's already made quite an impression. One of the first things he said actually was, when I got here, that I felt like the most important thing to do was listen, because you find out about people that way, you learn about people that way. And that's not a very coach thing, is it? You know, they normally come in and say, this is my philosophy and this is my brand and this is the way I do things. But I think the really interesting thing about Ilzer and Sturm, as sort of Lee touched on there, is the fact that this wasn't just an out of the blue thing. They've been building to this for a while, and they won the Austrian Cup the year before.
Yeah, and it's interesting because my knowledge of Austrian football comes from Lee, and Lee's sort of Lee bringing me up to speed on it. And it felt very much like there was this moment where things started to turn in the favour of Sturm Graz. You know, they've been a big club. They're not an unknown club. When we were growing up, you know, I'm a child of the 80s/90s. If you had to name an Austrian club, Sturm Graz would have been right up there. But it felt to me like there was this shift where suddenly, mentality-wise, there was a moment where Red Bull's sort of like Red Bull's dynasty and Red Bull's hold suddenly felt assailable. And I think, I don't know if I'm right in saying this, Lee, but it felt like mentally was as big a shift as on the pitch in a weird way. It was like this dominant force almost felt like no one would ever topple them. But suddenly there was a chink in the armour and it all kind of went quite quick from there.
I think the psychology is a really big element of it, actually, because I would argue that the gap financially between Red Bull Salzburg and the rest of the league is about as big as it could possibly be, probably bigger than any other European country between one club and the rest of the pack. And so I think there was a real importance in sort of getting the monkey off the back, so to speak, and ending the Red Bull dominance. And so I think once that happened for the first time, Sturm Graz have sort of made a flying start to this season as well, and Salzburg have made an equally bad one. But last year, the psychological factor was extremely important, that they could finally become the first team to dethrone Salzburg. It started with the Cup, Andy, as you say, the year before. So Sturm Graz had won the Cup in 2019 as well. But over the past decade, not only had Salzburg won 10 league titles, they'd won 8 of the 10 cups. And when you're hoovering up 90% of the major trophies in the space of a decade, it basically leaves the rest of the country fighting for scraps. And you've got these like tradition-steeped clubs like Rapid Vienna, Austria Vienna, Sturm Graz and Lask all competing for the occasional trophy that Salzburg let slip. So I really do think that the fact that they've now been able to end that dynasty will serve as a kind of inspiration for other clubs who now believe that they can threaten them, basically.
Well, you've already answered my question that I was about to ask about how relieved does Austrian football feel now that the wicked wizard's dead. But I think let's go on to Red Bull Salzburg a little bit, because it always is far too common a feeling, really, in modern football, and especially modern European football, isn't it? That when you have these massive runs, so you had Juventus and Bayern, that feeling of thank goodness that's over. Thank goodness that something else has won, and we've still got competitive sport really going on. But really, if we look at how last season fell apart for Salzburg, I mean, we can come up to, I suppose, where they're up to now. But was really the beginning of the end for them when Matthias Jessler went at the beginning of the season?
Yes, I think so. It's the short answer. I think it's because of the nature of that departure. So he basically left for Saudi Arabia on the eve of the season. So he was the coach that had been appointed in, I think, 2022, and he left to go to Saudi Arabia. And this left them with basically no time to bring in a new coach. And they ended up going for Gerhard Struber from the New York Red Bulls. And this felt like a bit of breaking from the mold in terms of their coaching appointments, because they usually bring in like exciting young coaches who are looking to sort of cut their managerial teeth. So you had Marco Rosa, Jesse Marsch, and this felt like a last minute sort of stopgap appointment, even though Struber did have a Red Bull past. And it's safe to say that he wasn't really the right man for the job. But I think that same summer, arguably a bigger blow was the loss of the long-serving sporting director Christoph Freund, who moved across the border to Bayern Munich. And he had basically been the architect of so many amazing transfers for Salzburg. You think of the likes of Erling Haaland, Dominik Szoboszlai, Patson Daka, Naby Keita, Sadio Mane, Karim Adeyemi, all Freund transfers. So I think that the double blow of losing the head coach and the sporting director was something that arguably they didn't really recover from all season.
So if we're talking about coaches, Paul, obviously Sturm Graz have been in the Champions League and had a few little moments in there. Can they keep it going post Ilzer, do you think?
I think they probably can. I think a lot is going to depend on how things go with Red Bull Salzburg. So as we say, they've taken a pretty severe step in firing Pep Linders. I mean, obviously, they are not where they want to be by a long stock. They, in fact, put out a statement that I saw that was pretty harsh. You know, usually when you sack a manager, there's quite a nice statement that goes along with it, however badly it's gone. I thought it was quite telling that even within the statement they put out, which was very short, they said, after a successful start to the season, there have been many unsatisfactory performances, which is what a statement that is, I thought. The timing's really interesting as well. Obviously, a lot of the talk in England's going to be about how this timing is, with obviously Klopp coming in into the Red Bull group. You know, it's very interesting then that Linders is departing on the eve, effectively, of Klopp sort of coming in. So I think it'll be a lot about how they rally, because if they rally, as Lee said, they've always got the resources, they've always got the players to turn things around.
Good of them to fire Pep Blinders, so Jurgen Klopp didn't have to do it. I tend to think.
No, that should have been the first thing, like in a mafia movie, right? That should have been the first thing. They bring him in and say, "Are you loyal to us, Jurgen?" He goes, "Yeah." They say, "Right, first of all, take Linda's in that room and shoot him." Yeah, that's what they should have said, right?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about getting made all of a sudden from Goodfellas. But that would have been quite a big entrance, I suppose. Talking of big entrances, let's look at TNS and them being the first side from the Cymru Premier to get into the proper group stage of European competition. An extraordinary story, really. We'll come to how they've fared in the Conference League a little bit later on. How historic is this, Paul?
Well, it's very historic, and it can be seen as quite a turning point for Welsh football. But they're a very strange club, the New Saints, in that they divide opinion. They're so disliked by many in the Welsh football scene. And that's basically, I think, for two primary reasons. One of which is just they're so dominant. They've won 14 titles in the past 19 years. They're the only full-time club in Wales. So it sometimes feels like the deck is stacked in their favour, a bit like we said with Red Bull.
Yeah.
Salzburg, this is like an extreme of that they seem like they've got a slight unfair advantage. But the other thing, and the glaring thing, is that they are based in Oswestry. So they are based over the border in England. And that leads to this kind of thing that's thrown at them again and again, that they are an English club. And so it's really interesting the way that this run in Europe has gone. It's been magnificent, and in many ways it has helped Welsh football in lots of different ways, coefficient wise, the money coming into Welsh football, but they are still disliked by a lot of people in Wales for the sheer nature of the club.
And it is, as you say, such an unusual situation. I mean, with them playing in England, whereas normally you have Welsh clubs playing in Wales but playing in the English League, if you're looking at Swansea and Cardiff and Wrexham, for example. Of course, they've played their European games in Shrewsbury this season because the stadium at Oswestry is not big enough to comply with everything that UEFA needs to stage Conference League games. I mean, you guys have been there this season. Tell us what the setup is like at Oswestry. I mean, we heard the comparison with Red Bull and Salzburg there. Obviously, Mike Harris, the guy who founded Total Network Solutions, has been pumping money into the club for decades now. What is the feel around the club on a match day?
When I was in Oswestry, I was there for a few days in the build-up to the game against Fiorentina, which was kind of this crazy moment, seeing this club that is set, Park Hall, the actual home of the New Saints in Oswestry, is in this rural setting. It doesn't feel at all like somewhere you'd find a football ground. You're over the road and there's a farm, and then there's some, pretty big sort of rural-looking houses, and then you're suddenly at this ground that feels like it pops out of nowhere. And it was really interesting watching the team preparing for this match, and in this stadium that's, fairly unassuming stadium, you've got them watching video of Fiorentina's players, and you could kind of see amongst the players there that this was something that was totally different to anything they'd experienced before. They were preparing for something really different. And what I found amazing personally was the coach, Craig Harrison. So his story is phenomenal. I don't know if you're aware of it. He was a really successful player, playing for Crystal Palace and sort of on his way to a very successful career, I think, at the top flight. Had a really terrible injury that just ended his career overnight. And so he basically walked away from football. He was in a pretty bad state, he admits. He says he was depressed. He walked away from football, couldn't even bear to see the game because he was so sad about it. And then this freak occurrence happened, that his wife booked a band for a surprise 30th birthday party. The guitarist was a former Wrexham player, Gareth Owen, who at the time was the player manager of Airbus UK. And he was looking for an assistant manager. And they had this kind of drunken conversation where he said, why don't you do it? Craig says, afterwards he sort of thought nothing more of it for a little while. And then it just stuck in his head. And he thought, I'm going to just give him a call. Gave him a call. Eventually ended up as assistant manager at Airbus. The other manager left. He became the main manager, did really well, and then was headhunted for TNS. So his career sort of launched out of this kind of weird coincidence. And he has become a dominant manager in that system, but also a really inspirational figure, I think, to these players. And so it all built up to him trying to get them ready for this Fiorentina game where they were clearly underdogs. Made even harder by the fact that Craig is terrified of flying. So he's a Dennis Bergkamp figure. So for him, he was like dreading the flight, and these players were in their own way very demotivated. So the fact they went over to Fiorentina and only lost 2-0, and it was a pretty narrow 2-0 defeat. They looked every bit as good as them at points. It's been a pretty remarkable run, and I think a lot of kudos has to go to Craig Harrison for the job he's done.
Yeah, and that assistant manager of Airbus title, I mean, it sounds big in the first place, but then when you factor in the whole fear of flying business, it gets pretty crazy. As I suppose, Lee, is European football coming to Shrewsbury, and really Shrewsbury being home to this huge moment where they get that first win, where they beat Astana, who of course end up playing Chelsea a little bit later in the group. How incredible is that?
That's one of the things that Paul and I love about the Conference League, that you get to see these teams from countries that usually don't get a chance on the European stage. And I know that sort of UEFA get quite a bit of flack sometimes, but I think in addition to the Nations League, the Conference League is just an absolutely amazing invention. And since it was launched in 21 to 22, I think there have been now 11 countries that had never previously had a representative in a group or a league phase of a European competition now getting their chance. And the new Saints this season, along with I think was it Viking Reykjavik of Iceland, have a chance to become the first Icelandic team in a knockout stage. You've got Larne from Northern Ireland as well, the first ever Northern Irish team. It's amazing. And of course, the Conference League throws up some massive away days as well. So those Kazakh fans that have made what would that be, like the 5,500 kilometre trip to turn up in Shrewsbury on a Thursday night. For us, it's just magical. We love it.
Yeah, it really is. So I guess, Paul, my question would be, as you've been to see TNS at pretty close quarters, Mike Harris is an ambitious guy. There's no getting around that. He's invested a lot in the club, in the community, and he's really dedicated to them connecting with that community. Where can they go next? Do you think the Conference League, as Lee was saying, really creates the possibility of them being able to qualify for Europe again and again?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting when you talk to Mike Harris. He has this story. As you say, he's a larger-than-life character. He kind of revels in the dislike of other people from in that system. He's very open about that. But he has this story that he always tells, that he basically got involved with the club when they were very small. They were Calantanfraid FC. They then merged with Oswestry Town. And, they were a tiny little club when he got involved first time. And he always says that when he was just starting out, he used to say to people, I'm going to take this club into Europe. We're going to get into Europe one day. And people used to just laugh at him and say, well, that's rubbish. And now, they've got where it is that he said they were going to be. And he says, no one's kind of laughing now. Now we're going to get into the Champions League. And again, your instinct is sort of to laugh, isn't it, that they would reach the Champions League group stage. But you do have to wonder, is there a possibility somewhere down the line that is the trajectory they're on? One thing that really came through from being around the club and around everyone kind of in Welsh football that I spoke to was that there's a weird dynamic that everyone at the New Saints was saying they kind of want other clubs in Wales to throw some money at it, to really take them on, because I think there's a sense that they're saying, well, look, other people say we're a false entity because we just got all this money and we've thrown it. Well, why doesn't someone else do this in Wales? Come on, have a go at us. And what's really interesting is in the league this season, they're actually in second place. They're second to Penny Bont. They've had quite a tough league season because I think their European engagements have left them quite drained. So it's interesting you're saying this. There's a reality where they could be in the Champions League, or they could use this as a European springboard. There's also a reality where they're not even champions this year. So it's a really interesting time, I think, in Welsh football.
Well, it was great hearing about your travels to one exotic location, from one to another. I know, Lee, that earlier this calendar year, you went out to Madeira, known as the birthplace of Cristiano Ronaldo, of course, but home to two clubs of reasonable standing in Nacional and Madeira. Both started 2024 as teams in the second tier of Portuguese football, and you went to the derby. How was it?
It was amazing. I think the motivation to go was basically to try and work out what had happened to Portugal's island clubs, because, as you say, you have Maritimo and Nacional in Madeira, but you also have Santa Clara in the Azores, and they've been regulars in the Portuguese top flight for decades. But we spotted last season that this was the first year since, I think, 1985 that there were no island clubs. So I thought, well, Madeira's a nice place to go. Let's go there, try and see the game and work out what's going on with the island clubs. And I think really the conclusion I came away with was that it was a bit of a coincidence rather than anything else, because Maritimo had been in the top flight throughout that 38-year period, and they'd finally been relegated. And I think they'd been the ones that had been keeping this record going for island clubs, and they'd finally gone down. Nacional have probably been Madeira's standout team over the past 2 decades. They've got into the Europa League a couple of times. Watching them go head-to-head was really interesting for several reasons. I think it was quite interesting to me to have an away fan culture at games in Madeira, because generally speaking, you know, this is an island that is 900 kilometres off the south coast of the Portuguese mainland. And apart from the big clubs, your Sportings, Benficas and Portos, I don't think that many away fans really travel to the islands. It's not exactly an easy away day. It's certainly expensive for most fans. But obviously, when it's 2 clubs based on Madeira, they then have this opportunity to easily go to a game as away fans. And I think that was really embraced by the home fans as well. There was a lovely atmosphere, but not like a spicy, edgy atmosphere. Like when the Nacional fans all turned up on their fan march, the Maritimo fans all stopped, sort of looked at them. There was no shouting. There was no hostility. It just seemed like a really good-natured football match, to be honest. On the pitch, Maritimo won 3-1. But Nacional, I thought, were a lot better that day and were a little bit unlucky to come away as the losers. And in the end, they went up at the end of the season. But I would say of all the places we've been to this year, and we've probably been, between Paul and I, probably 10 to 12 countries to see football, I would say Madeira was my highlight, especially because it was 25 degrees in January.
Of course, that's the thing. When you talk about those away trips, Paul, it's just the fact that if you're going on an away day to Madeira, not only is it a commitment, but there's a chance that the game will get called off. I mean, this game was played at the Estadio do Maritimo's home ground, obviously, and the pitch was fairly muddy, giving us a bit of a hint of how it can be like in the islands. And we see that sort of thing in Corsica, at Bastia and Ajaccio, of course, and really, really heavy pitches that seem like a relic of football from the past. I wanted to talk a bit about Nacional's ground, though, because they're not that far apart. They're about 10 kilometres apart. But the weather at Chupana, where Nacional play, there's a sort of microclimate to it. It always seems to affect the Portuguese title race. You always get a surprise defeat there or a game called off there, so a team have to make a second trip there. In fact, that's Benfica this season. They had a game that started. It was delayed for half an hour. Then it was called off because you could literally not see beyond the end of your nose. It's a special place, Chupana, isn't it?
It is. You mentioned that game, and it was this season as well, wasn't it? So this season, Benfica went to Nacional. The game was cut short for the fog after, something like 8 minutes in, or they basically just started and it was unplayable. But this exactly same thing had happened only a matter of a few years ago, hadn't it? I think almost to the minute of the game that they had to cancel it in. Something like they'd cancelled a game in the 7th minute a few years back. And so the idea of coming all that way, obviously for the players and for the team, but for the fans, as you say, if you're going to do that away day, there is a fair chance you might not even see a game of football, which is quite something. And I think one thing that we saw on the other side of this, wasn't it, Lee, that during COVID, the island teams had a pretty rough run of it because was it Santa Clara at the time? There was a team that had to relocate to the Portuguese mainland effectively for months on end.
Yeah, they had to play in Lisbon at the equivalent of St George's Park, really. So it's so unusual. I mean, COVID seems like a really long time ago, doesn't it? Because these things seem a little bit surreal, like Real Madrid playing their games at Valdebebas, for example.
Yeah, it almost seems like another world, doesn't it? It feels like you question that this actually happened. But, I think we've dealt with in our time, Lee, some like pretty remote teams entering leagues that are difficult to play in. But this thing of having to take a team and just say, look, here you are, plonk you down on the mainland. You're not going to see friends and family for X number of months. It's surely going to sap your morale. It's going to sap like your will to live after a while, isn't it?
Andy, you also mentioned there the fact that the two stadiums in Madeira are only 10 kilometres apart. But the interesting thing about Madeira's geography is that the Estadio do Marítimo, where I saw the game, is right down on the coast. But Madeira has a remarkably steep cliff face, and the Nacional Stadium is inland. So actually, it's really hard to get to, and you have to go. You can get the cable car up or you can drive, but it's at a much higher altitude than the other ground, which probably explains why the fog descends and that it has this microclimate, whereas the other stadium doesn't. But when I was in Madeira, I actually went for a hike one day, and we started by the coast, and it was sunny, 25 degrees. We got to the middle of the island. It was cloudy, rainy, cold. It's amazing how quickly it all changes. So I can actually really understand why the Nacional Stadium, being a bit inland, has that sort of microclimate.
Yeah, I think the idea is, I'm not going to get too meteorological about it, but the idea is with, as you say, Marítimo being by the coast, the wind blows away the fog. I just remember like hearing the commentators on that Nacional Benfica game at Chupana that Paul was talking about earlier in the season, going, we're waiting for the wind to blow away the fog. It's not coming. It's not coming. I think this game's really not happening. But Nacional have done an incredible job to be back in the top flight. I mean, they actually lost both derbies to Marítimo last season. Marítimo just missed out in the playoffs. Nacional went up. I mean, I love a bit of Ireland football, Lee. I don't know about you. It is good to see one of them back in the top flight, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think Santa Clara joined them as well. So I think there's two
Ireland
clubs.
Yeah.
And as you say, Marítimo just missed out. We could have immediately had a return for the three of them. The thing that was quite interesting towards the end of the season is that Nacional finished second behind Santa Clara, but there was a chance that they could end up finishing above them because I think they had a game against Legsoes where Legsoes fielded an ineligible player, and there was a complaint filed. Basically, was this an ineligible player? And so they were wondering if they would then get 2 extra points, which would take them above Santa Clara after the end of the season. But in the end, that didn't happen, and they still went up anyway.
Wasn't there a player who had the trophy tattooed on him?
Yes.
And if that deduction had happened, they would have actually finished second. So I think he definitely had a very nervous wait refreshing on the verdict there.
I mean, the fact is, unless you have that tattoo and display it in the sun, it's not going to come back and bite you, is it? That's normally the thing, Manchester City Champions League winners 2015 or whatever. That's normally the vibe, isn't it? Before I let you both go, I'm going to have to press you for one answer each. Paul, best trip that you undertook in 2024.
Well, this was one I did with Lee, and I don't even have to think about this. It was San Marino's historic win over Liechtenstein, the first win in 20 years. We were lucky to both be there in Serravalle, otherwise the other one probably would never talk to the other one again, having missed out on that one. But yeah, it was an amazing moment seeing that. I think it was my 4th attempt to see San Marino win, and Lee's 4th too. And just that moment of seeing that jubilation when they finally were released from this like never-ending cycle of defeat and draw. So yeah, that was mine for sure.
Be honest, did one or both of you take your boots just in case?
You say, right, that sounds ridiculous, not to San Marino, but I do generally take boots when I go to far-flung places, because I always have this vision of this will be when I get the call.
So I guess the final question for you, Lee, is where will you both be taking your boots to in 2025?
It's a tough one. I'll give you 2 answers. On the more obscure side of things, Paul and I have been itching to get to the Vatican for a while.
Oh, yes.
because they have a league and a cup where all of the different departments play each other. So you have like the children's hospice playing against the Swiss Guards, all this kind of thing. And the Vatican's so small it doesn't even have its own pitch, so they play the games outside in Rome. And I think both Paul and I would really love to go there. I think a slightly more mainstream destination, I think we'd like to get to the Nordic countries a bit more. And having seen how good Bodo Glimt have been over the last 3 or 4 years, I think I'd be pretty keen to go up to the Arctic Circle, perhaps at a slightly warmer time of year, but check Bodo Glimt out in Norway's league, and maybe even get to the Faroes as well, because we've been following the fortunes of Koyi Klaksvik as well, who were the first Faroese team to get into a European competition last season. So I think, Nordic nations would be right up there.
Well, look, thank you so much for joining us, fellas. It's been great. And do subscribe to The Sweeper. They've got loads of other fascinating stories that we just really scrape the surface of there. And thank you for listening to On the Continent. Make sure you join us again tomorrow for a special end-of-year edition of OTC. And make sure to subscribe in your podcast app so that you never miss an episode.